Hello, and welcome to my EDC 250 Learning Disabilities Screencast by Savannah Diaz. The history. The term learning disability describes a set of neurological conditions which interferes with learning. This can vary from mild to severe and includes attention deficit, socioeconomic factors, and emotional issues of a student. Here we see a timeline of special education starting with Samuel Orton in 1937, who discovered what we now call dyslexia. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, research on LD was very limited and limited to brain trauma only, and all disabilities were educated in the same way. In 1963, the ACLD was formed in Chicago, which was an advocacy group for students with disabilities. In 1975, Public Law 94-142 was passed, which guaranteed free and appropriate public education for students. In 1990, Congress passed the IDEA, which expanded and redefined many things from Public Law 94-142. The IDEA has been reauthorized in 1996 and 2004. Other pioneers of special education include William Kershank, who discovered that many children's problems were coming from deficits in perception and deficits in attention. We also have Alana Border, Byron Rourke, and Linda Siegel, who pioneered the creation of LD subtypes in the 1970s. Public Law 142 and Section 504. Public Law 142 was created in 1975 and guarantees free and appropriate public education to students in the least restrictive environment. Section 504 gives access to education and employment for people with disabilities and requires that reasonable accommodations and modifications be made. Factors of a learning disability. Since the term learning disability is very broad, so too are its causal and incidence factors. Factors which may cause a learning disability include familial factors, pregnancy and delivery, trauma, and exposure to toxins such as lead. Incidence factors are very hard to point out because they vary from region to region. Our best estimate is that 5 to 30% of people have some sort of disability, with 5 to 15% being a learning disability. 20% of all people have reading issues, with 3 to 8% of students being diagnosed with ADHD, and 1 in 150 being diagnosed as autistic. Characteristics of a learning disability. The most common characteristic of a learning disability is a perceptual deficit, which is a misinterpretation from sensory input to the brain. 80% of students with a learning disability also have trouble reading due to phonological processing deficits. Co-occurring conditions. Here we see 3 of the most co-occurring conditions: ADHD and LD, conduct disorder and ADHD, and Tourette syndrome with ADHD and/or a learning disability. Much of this has to do with the impulsivity that is marked by ADHD, as well as the lack of attention. Lack of attention comes into play with a learning disability, which happens in 1 out of 3 students with ADHD. While impulsivity comes more with a conduct disorder, which is when a student lacks respect for the rights of others. Tourette's and ADHD are mostly caused by neurological factors, and the results of which can cause a learning disorder. Programs in the least restrictive environment. From ages 3 to 5, there is an early intervention team. However, for school-age students, the least restrictive environment takes into account resource rooms so that a student may only be separated from regular education for part of the day, assistance in the classrooms such as interpretation, or accommodations and modifications such as larger tests, more time on tests, or a modification of the answers on a quiz. Attributes. Here we see a diagram of the brain broken up into 5. The frontal lobe controls problem solving, while the parietal lobe controls sensory input, the occipital lobe controls visual information, the cerebellum controls balance and coordination, while the temporal lobe controls hearing and language. Brain injury. There's a variety of possibilities when dealing with brain injuries. This could have to do with memory and attention, or the ability to speak or memorize a language. Brain injury can also cause cerebral palsy in a car crash. It has also been shown that with multiple injuries to the brain, all of these problems only tend to get worse. The brain and autism. Autism is most commonly marked by lacking in social interactions and communication with others. Recent studies have shown that people with autism have abnormal white cerebral matter and enlarged cortical gray matter throughout the brain. As they grow older, the cerebral areas reduce, which is thought to be the cause of the lack of ability to communicate with others. The brain and ADHD. While ADHD can be caused by toxins such as lead, it is usually caused by inconsistent processing of sensory input from the central nervous system. And what happens is the sensory input goes through the central nervous system. The order in which it is processed is mixed up. There are also many more excitatory chemicals throughout the brain of a person with ADHD. Biochemicals and learning. Biochemicals can be influenced by food, medications, and toxins. We can see that food influences biochemicals as many students with ADHD eat more and more so that they can control the chemicals within their body. Stimulants are often given to people with ADHD as they force messages across neurotransmitters, which account for improvements in 75% of students on medication. Memory. It has recently been shown that much of memory comes from the hippocampus, and that the health of this memory is dependent on the health of the proteins within your hippocampus. Memory is also controlled by chemical signals throughout the brain, which can be strengthened by visual support. Many students have short-term memory problems, which is why a common accommodation is more time on tests and assignments. Metacognition is the ability to control one's own thinking and learning. We can improve metacognition by drilling students, asking students to make predictions, or asking students to visualize or verbalize, as well as using mnemonics, such as never eat soggy Wheaties. Phonological processing problems. This is a problem in processing sounds in the order of language. This is also a problem that takes place in the temporal lobe with the temporal order of speech stimuli. We can see this in delayed speech in young students. A way to kind of strengthen a phonological processing problem is to have often quick discussions with your students about phonological processes and give them skills and drills that they can use to try to strengthen this in school and at home. Next, we'll discuss the IEP. The MET. The MET is the multidisciplinary evaluation team who evaluates and reevaluates a student with disabilities and determines the eligibility of a student. This happens after a student has gone through all tiers of RTI and has shown no improvement. The MET must include at least 2 members, one of which being an expert, which is usually the school psychologist, who tests the student and makes a recommendation on whether or not a student needs special education support. The READ, or Review of Existing Evaluating Data. This determines the existence of a disability and can determine the continuation of services for a student. This also includes accommodations and modifications to see if the accommodations and modifications are indeed having a positive influence on the student. An IEPT is an individualized educational planning team, which reviews the needs of a child, reviews the MET information, and it includes the general education teachers, special education teachers, school guidance counselors, parents, and students. The IEP. The 2 most common types of IEP is the initial IEP and the transition IEP. The initial IEP is the first IEP that is drawn up and is built upon throughout a child's years in the special education. The initial IEP is what is reevaluated. The transition IEP comes into play when a student turns 16 years old, or this can happen sooner if it is deemed necessary. The transition IEP includes life goals for after post-secondary education and a continuation of services federally until a student is 22. Annual review IEP happens at least once per year and reviews and revises an IEP and anticipates students' needs. The reevaluation IEP happens every 3 years. Reevaluation usually is retesting a student to see if they are still eligible for education services. However, we can waive the reevaluation if the IEPT deems it necessary. If a reevaluation is needed, then the student is retested and the eligibility is determined again. Manifestation determination. A manifestation determination determines if a behavior is the result of a disability. This happens with an IEP team meeting and looks at all incidences in accordance with the characteristics of a student's disability. This also sees if aids and interventions are being followed. If it is found that a student's behavior is indeed a result of their disability, discipline may not be applicable. Due process hearing. A due process hearing can happen if someone feels that a student is not receiving their free and appropriate public education. This usually is a result of disagreements on the IEP, aids and services, or the way in which a student's case is being handled. This is a safeguard for students and parents so that a student may not be stripped of their right to a free and appropriate public education. Keeping the IEP current. In order to keep the IEP current, there are addendums which you can revise throughout the year that an IEP is in effect. The parent and school must agree on the goal and objectives that are added, deleted, or modified. Progress reporting is on IEP goals and objectives. This happens 4 times per goal per year and shows the progress of a student before an annual IEP occurs again. Lastly, we'll discuss the law in accordance to the LD. This will have to do with Public Law 94-142, Section 504, IDEA, and No Child Left Behind. Parental rights. Parental rights are intended to keep parents informed and involved. Parents have the right to a child's records, and they may make copies of these records or share them with a non-professional member with written consent from the school. Parents must also be notified of any meetings that have to do with their student. And parents may request an independent evaluation at public expense if they feel that the school's evaluations are not just. Parents also have the right to input in the student's IEP. IDEA in Section 504. The IDEA, passed in 1990, provides additional funds for students with disability, includes specific categories, and has formal evaluations. While Section 504 does not have additional funds for students with disabilities, includes all disabilities, and has no formal evaluation. Parental advocacy. Parental advocacy has many online resources such as the LD Association and training seminar with Rights Law, which shows parents how to get involved. The best way to do this is to keep your eyes and ears open and ask questions and always stand up for a student's rights. Next, we'll talk about student rights. A student has the right to due process safeguards, free and appropriate public education, accommodations and modifications if necessary, a right to their own record, and the right to be heard in their IEP and their goals for their own education. Next, we'll discuss teachers. The rights of teachers is to stay in a safe environment, be able to teach, and be treated respectfully. A teacher's obligation is to notify a parent before evaluations to set up an IEP, to follow IEP guidelines, and to realize parental rights. Behavior intervention plans. If a student is having difficulty with their behavior, a student must meet with parents and the IEPT to see if a behavioral intervention plan can be made. A behavioral intervention plan addresses the student's behaviors and provides goals to improve these behaviors. The student, school, and parents all have responsibilities throughout the BIP. Suspension and expulsion rights. A manifestation determination must be made before suspension, as well as a BIP must be written. All other alternatives must be considered before expelling a student, and a school may not pressure parents or a student to move out of the school. And lastly, before expulsion, there should be an attempt in the change of placement. Thank you.